So, welcome to the panel, Marina from the European Crypto Initiative, Executive Director and Co-founder, and UCI being a strong voice in the advocacy space in Europe. We have Abhishek, General Counsel from the NEAR Foundation. Thank you so much for being here.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And we have Karen from Gnosis, also General Counsel there, and long-term lawyer in the space, and Gnosis obviously needs no introduction, a big, important player in the DeFi scene. So we want to discuss how to build the legal fabric of OpenFi. And I want to start with you, Marina. Given the European approach to regulating all of crypto with this new law called Markets in Crypto Assets, or MiCA for short, what are sort of the overlooked or under-discussed topics that really everybody in this room should be talking or thinking about right now, but maybe are not yet because, not everybody's a lawyer. So help us.
Thank you for the question and thank you for the invite. So the Markets in Crypto Assets regulation is something that is supposed to regulate centralized entities like exchanges, custodials, etc. And that's where most of the focus has been on. Besides that, stablecoins as well. So you have probably heard news about the stablecoin part of MiCA being applicable already. We have 2 regulated stablecoins right now in Europe that are already, in a way, licensed. And this is the first part of MiCA. The second part that is regulating centralized entities is going to be applicable very soon, so at the beginning of the year. And this is where most of the work, I would say, went in. And this is also where I would say if we have here representatives of different centralized exchanges, they would say, of course, we're working on that for months already, and we are kind of getting ready to be compliant at the beginning of the year. So that's all fine. But then we have the other part that is I would say we're discussing here OpenFi, DeFi, DAOs, decentralization, even NFTs fall into this category that in theory should be excluded from MiCA, so they should be out of the scope, but in practice there's a lot of questions around that. And we don't know where the line is because most of the definitions, lawyers will really like definitions. So most of the definitions in MiCA, when it comes to those topics, are negative. So what is an NFT? It's something that is, non-fungible. So what does fungible mean? What does non-fungible mean? What is a DAO? It's something that is non-centralized. So what does decentralization mean? There's no further explanations, and there's no further, let's say, opinions or paper written on that, and it will really be on the national competent authorities that are going to define those topics. There are 27 different national competent authorities, plus 3 that are a part of the European Economic Area. So you can have 30 different, in theory, 30 different definitions, and then in theory also, MiCA is supposed to be a regulation, which means it's supposed to be equally and in the same way applicable in all the member states. But in practice, we'll see how this will happen. So I'll stop here. We can discuss this for the whole hour, but that is just like an intro to where the problem is arising from.
Super interesting. Karen, as GC of Gnosis, you have a unique vantage point on the industry, and you've solved some unique challenges for Gnosis over the years. For all the builders in the room, what would you say are the top priorities for builders in the DeFi space right now? What should they be looking at? What are you looking at? And what are you willing to share?
So I think it depends on the nature of the application and the use case, first and foremost. So I think having a very clear idea of what it is you want to build and what utility it's going to serve, that's a really good starting point, because from there, you can then start to map out what are going to be the different legal and regulatory challenges that you might become subject to. Within DeFi, of course, anytime there's some kind of trading facility made available, there's going to be certain touch points with regulation. And then it comes down to a question of what is that developer application's role in facilitating a transaction from occurring. And the greater degree of control or influence, I would say, the higher the regulatory temperature. And the greater the scope that a regulator might come knocking on your door and first want to better understand what it is you're doing and how it's been developed, what are the different controls that are in place through which you may be able to influence, manipulate, rug pull assets. And then there might be an expectation that if you want to continue offering these services, particularly within Europe and other jurisdictions that have established regulatory frameworks for these activities, that you will be expected to get a license. The alternative is if you are building something that's truly decentralized, or you don't have any control over how that application protocol works, and you don't necessarily want to get into that regulatory engagement process at this stage, what a lot of projects are doing are moving offshore and into jurisdictions where they have a bit more of a flexible regime when it comes to interpreting and applying their regulatory framework. So I wouldn't say there's like a one-size-fits-all. It very much depends on the use case, strategy, and yeah, where you see that product going and who is it going to be used by.
Abi, at Near, you're providing sort of a foundation for other builders to build their apps on. From the vantage point of an ecosystem like Near, what do you think going forward will be the role of an ecosystem when it comes to compliance of the builders? Should ecosystems be proactive here? Should there be some primitives that you provide, or do you think that should be something that the builders figure out for themselves? Where do you see Near and generally like the foundations in this?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think first and foremost, it's a spectrum, right? So we've seen differing approaches. Let's take Polkadot, for example, which has a relationship with Merkle Science, which has been quite advertised. They partner with Merkle Science for various compliance initiatives, including AML identification across their ecosystem. So that's an example of an ecosystem that's taken a much more involved role in sort of, call it policing or otherwise, guardrailing builders in that way. In the case of the Near ecosystem, I think and in particular in the case of the foundation's role is to support the growth and development of the Near ecosystem, but it is not, in our view, to police or provide the sort of it's not to really police these projects individually. And so what we're trying to do in terms of the primitives, it's a great question. We partnered with Predicate. Predicate is building a decentralized policy engine that can be sort of modularly adapted to various smart contracts. So that, say, for example, I don't want wallets that have transacted with OFAC-sanctioned wallets to transact on a bridge or on some type of infrastructure. I can now kind of create programmatic rules to ensure that. And so I think those are two differing approaches. One using a sort of service provider, another to using kind of modular policy engine to achieve similar goals. And frankly, personal opinion, not of the necessarily of the foundation. I prefer the latter approach. I don't think it's the role of a foundation to be using centralized service providers to effectively police in that manner.
Yeah. Karen, maybe back to you quickly on Gnosis. When I look at the entire Gnosis project, which now is many different companies, obviously, it seems like you guys have been going for a hybrid approach, some regulated products like Gnosis Pay, some super decentralized products, let's say CowSwap, or where do you see the focus going forward? Is it the regulated products because this is where the mainstream will come in, or do you think there's a world where the really decentralized ones will also be able to gain mass adoption?
So at Gnosis, we remain true to our beliefs in Web3 from where we originated. We very much believe that self-custody, decentralization, credible neutrality are the ways forward. But we're not ignorant to the fact as well that there are existing regulations, there are big institutions that require certain assurances in order to get involved in the space and in order to partner up with you. And therefore, if we really want to see further adoption and growth for a lot of the things that we're building, we realized that we had no choice then other than to get into that regulated environment. And the way that we see it is that, it's not that we're going to be focusing on the regulated space over the, let's say, the more pure Web3 space, but we see as the regulated arm of everything that we do being a support function for all of the decentralization stuff that we build. So in the case of Gnosis Pay, for example, in order to issue a Visa card or a MasterCard debit card, you need to be regulated, right? But the back-end infrastructure through which we issue that card is still very much based on open permissionless networks, self-custody wallets, so staying true. So we're seeing this hybrid, exactly as you said, but it's to leverage everything that we've built within the Web3 infrastructure to bring it to the masses through having this regulatory authorization.
Focusing on this sort of interplay of institutional adoption, regulated adoption versus the original values of DeFi, OpenFi, in particular around privacy. Marina, what is your perspective on privacy in the context of Mika? We know that privacy coins are not really, I think, allowed in there. Privacy enhancing technologies like privacy pools, Tornado Cash have been very controversial. Do you see any room for regulatory flexibility, or is fully KYC'd DeFi sort of a guaranteed future that we're heading into? How do you see that?
Yeah, so that's a very important question. We're spending a lot of time here at DevCon and this week discussing privacy. There's so many events. There's a huge line of events also during and talks during DevCon. And it is such a complex thing. It's a very complex topic because it basically, there's so many regulations, directives, and also other laws covering that. And if you think about privacy in general, we have the privacy and encryption when it comes to communication, which we as an organization are not focusing as much on, but it's more on a financial privacy, as you mentioned. And in the last 4 years, we have been negotiating the markets in crypto assets regulation that basically says, crypto asset service providers, they need to follow anti-money laundering laws and transfer of funds regulation laws. So basically, they are just referring to those other laws that have been accepted in a whole package. There was 4 in Europe discussing this topic. And in a way, all those were adjusted or to the crypto world, or they were like additional articles added specifically for crypto. And what we have seen, unfortunately, is that crypto is treated much more severely than cash, for example. That's not something that we agree with. At least we should have the same, the same line, the same rules for cash and for crypto. But because it is digital, because it is something that is easy to use, I think the regulators had kind of this perception that is dangerous at the same time. And I would say that all the research that has happened through chain analysis and other reports showing that crypto is not really used for, terrorist financing and money laundering in such a percentage that, other activities are, this argument is not helping. It's not helping at all. Like, until there is 0, they're not going to basically take this argument into consideration. At least this was our experience. And I think that an approach to basically advocate and work on privacy should be very structured and should be a very, very long-term one. Because we can work on, discussing with politicians about privacy in Europe, but of course there are international organizations that are also following with rules and in a way leading with those rules, as FATF, etc. So there's not much, I would say, freedom that even those big member states, nations, or the European Union have when it comes to the implementation of FATF recommendations. And the transfer of funds regulation, for example, that is going to become applicable the same day as MiCA next year, is just an implementation of FATF recommendations. And this rule is basically saying you should follow transactions, so that's why it's called the travel rule. You should follow transactions of crypto that happen between crypto asset service providers, but also between wallets and crypto asset service providers. And this is going to be, I would say, very thoroughly followed. And this is going to be something that a lot of crypto asset service providers are adjusting to. And I think that it's also very important how they are interpreting those rules. So for example, they're going to check, for red flags. In the European Banking Authority guidance, the red flags are something where you have multiple wallets. So if you have a lot of wallets, it's already red flagged because, they think you have done something or you're trying to just not show what the transactions are or just somehow obfuscating the kind of history of the transactions you had. But at the same time, it's a very good practice when it comes to privacy and security of your funds. And there are different, guidance and rules like that. There are, in a way, maybe a little bit more soft rules, and it will really depend on the interpretation of the crypto as a service providers. How are they going to execute that in practice, and how many messages you will get back from them saying, look, maybe there's a problem, we need a little bit longer to check all the funds that are coming from this specific wallet.
Abi, a question to you from the near perspective. Do you think a blockchain can be both attractive for the kind of institutional adoption that the European MiCA foresees with a fully KYC'd world, and the sort of DeFi world where, people do meme coin speculations and sort of all the craziness that we see? Can a blockchain be interesting for both, or do you think they sort of have to pick sort of one, direction or the other?
Well, I mean, look, the NEAR ecosystem is a permissionless, decentralized open source ecosystem. So ultimately, people can do what they want. Right? And we're not going to, as a foundation, dictate, nor can we, nor should we, what that will look like. And indeed, in our ecosystem, we've seen both sides of this, proverbial coin. On one side, we've got institutional partnerships like Libre, Hashnote. These are Laser Digital. These are, large institutional partners that have come and see a demand for effectively NEAR-backed, various NEAR-backed financial instruments, and so including, another example, TrueFin, on the liquid staking, institutional liquid staking front. So that's one side of the coin. On the other side of the coin, we've seen meme cooking launch on in the NEAR ecosystem, and effectively a meme coin launch platform that was brought by the Shih Tzu team, which is a meme coin team in the NEAR ecosystem. So both sides are building, both sides are progressing, and again, it's our role to to ensure that the principles that that really the NEAR ecosystem and protocol were founded on, those again being the permissionless, decentralized, open source nature, are preserved such that both sides can flourish.
Is NEAR developing or sort of promoting or investing in KYC-related infrastructure on the network? Do you have a vision towards sort of, some holistic solution to this, hairy problem, or are you staying out of that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, from speaking from the foundation's perspective, of course, we have KYC obligations, and we have service providers that we use. We've used Fractal. We've partnered with SumSub as well, and so that's at the foundation level. For the broader ecosystem, I'd prefer to see an open, talk about OpenFi, open KYC, or open, really IDOS. And it is why we are here. It's the vision and enormity of IDOS, I think, is extremely exciting to us. It's why we've partnered and taken an active leadership role in the project. And I think that it's an open ecosystem where people can choose modularly their own providers, and ultimately we hope be able to port credentials from one place to another using ZK. Now, are we there yet from a regulatory perspective? Maybe Karan has a little more skepticism, so I will turn it to maybe Karan for a second to express that skepticism. But nothing. Uber didn't start with regulatory clarity either. So I think we need to accept that, the things that we want are not necessarily going to be, possible from a legal perspective, at least a strict legal perspective today.
Perfect question for
and
Karen.
A great transition. I put you on the spot.
Give us the answers. Yeah.
So, look, the concept of IDOS I love. I think it is, a great solution to give people a lot more ownership over their data, which is, one of the core principles of this Web3 space. My skepticism comes from the willingness of regulated institutions to adopt it. And let's say the business case for established players who issue credentials to almost flip their entire business models to support this kind of, let's say, onboarding arrangement. And then I think there is a lot of work also that needs to be done in how these types of, agent-centric data models interact with things like GDPR. I haven't done a deep analysis of that, but that's why I say there are a number of regulatory questions which I think there needs to be a very firm legal footing before you can go to regulated institutions, banks, governments, and say, this is the way we need to do KYC in the future, and this is why you should adopt these things. So I'm not against what we're building here. I'm fully supportive of it. Gnosis are investor in IDOS as well, and we're very much encouraging these types of solutions. But I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done from building this out to actually getting it used in practice for hundreds and thousands of people.
Let's try to dispel a myth in this space, which seems to be that some people believe, and teams I think are even building for that future, that it's fundamentally possible to do credential sharing in KYC. Like I KYC'd with company A, now I just go to company B and whoop, I don't have to KYC again because I did it with A. Is that currently possible from your point of view? Should that be possible? And is the technology there to support this sort of vision where I'm KYC'd once, but sort of accepted everywhere? Karen.
I think the technology is there. I don't think there's a technological restriction from being able to do that. I think the standards of KYC might make that a challenge, especially when you think about having to update your KYC at periodic intervals because something you submitted a year or 2 years ago is no longer acceptable. And so I think you will need to continue to provide new KYC even in this model once certain credentials get out of date. This is why I think there needs to be a paradigm shift in accepting different forms of KYC beyond what we have in existing frameworks today. Things like providing a proof of address that's no older than 3 months old means you can only reuse that credential for the next 3 months, right? So I think there needs to be a shift and attribute, let's say, identity to other factors beyond just where do you live and what's your passport, right? I think you can use a lot of different tools. You can collect data from many different sources in order to identify a person and know that the person you're entering into a relationship with is not an illegitimate actor, is not involved in money laundering activities, by also protecting your business at the same time. I don't think it means that you're exposing yourself to greater risk. I just think there's other ways to achieve the same outcome. But again, that needs acceptance from governmental and institutional level before we can really see that flourish.
Interesting. Marina, just as an opportunity for you, are there currently discussions at the EU level or something that UCI is pushing for to get into this future of the, decentralized credential sharing, this agent-centric model, I think how Karen called it?
Yeah, so in Europe we have another very interesting thing, which is sometimes the European Commission acts as a product manager. So they're coming up with products themselves and they could use or they want to use in their administration. And such similar one was, let's say, ADAS, the wallet, or EPSI, the infrastructure that they were working on. which is EVM compatible, but still it's kind of being developed within this EPSI infrastructure that was a part of the European Commission. Right now we're going through a very interesting transition where the Commission is not really interested to fund this project anymore, and they are giving it up to the member states, where the member states are going to, and they're already running their nodes, and they would need to be the ones governing this infrastructure. To my knowledge, at the moment, there are problems in governance, very similarly to what we have in DAOs in general in this ecosystem. So it's taking longer than predicted. Some people, some member states don't agree with what has been discussed, etc. But we'll see how these things will evolve in the next months. And a part of this infrastructure, it's even aimed to develop further into a project that is called Europeum. So basically some kind of a blockchain that is a European blockchain, and it is called European. So we're not even, kind of competing with different products. We're also competing with something that the European Commission comes up on their own and basically presenting within their administration how and what they should use or would use. So it's very creative. The main aim is really to be European and to support kind of European ideas, etc. Sometimes it's even, pretty important, even more important than what the actual project is or product is out there. But I think it at least gives us kind of hope that there is some thinking around that they are trying to understand this. I think they were really, really open to also understand what is the latest, updates from the technology, what's going on. They're organizing events, discussing this infrastructural questions. So I think this is a really good point. But I would want to, mention what Abshinek said before. Airbnb and, Uber, they were very heavy on, I would say, policy, lobbying, whatever we want to call it. And it was a business model that was non-existent. It's still illegal in a lot of member states, even in Europe. We don't have Uber in every country. So they have put so much effort into convincing the governments that they should, accept this new business model or technology, whatever that is, to have it available for everyone. So I think if we really care about privacy, we should do something similarly, and hopefully collectively as a community.
That's a perfect segue into my next set of questions, which relates to our industry's efforts, or lack of efforts, to actually talk with regulators and make them see our vision, maybe make them, build their blockchain on a specific protocol. Abi, what is your view from, again, the foundation's perspective on neutrality versus taking an active sort of stance on lobbying and actually talking to regulators? I think we see different approaches out there. Where do you see Near? Are you more like, whatever happens, happens? Or are you trying to actually be on the table with a regulator?
I mean, it depends where. I think the United States is pretty promising right now from the perspective of the administration, the new, incoming administration's sort of optimism for the space. And I think, if you'd asked me, was there much value in lobbying Gary Gensler to change his view, I would have said no. It's a waste of time, and all of that money I'm going to spend, defending, not necessarily in the foundation's case, but in the case of others, defending regulatory actions indeed brought by regulators inappropriately, as opposed to spending that on lobbying. And indeed, that was kind of like lobbying in a way, right? The amici briefs from a variety of folks, say even Paradigm's research lab, for example, that's kind of a form of it's a form of lobbying in and of itself. It's trying to explain why our view of the legal framework is the right one. I think we're now at an exciting opportunity, at least in the US, which is where I kind of started my response, to potentially build from the ground up. Because one of the key problems is, and we'll see how the legislative proposals in the US kind of develop. We saw Fit 21, we saw Loomis Gillibrand and others, but I think there's an opportunity now to actually do a complete reset and try to build from a principles first legislative proposal. And indeed, JD Vance as vice president and his historic interest in this space, I think again presents that opportunity. So long-winded way of saying depends on where, depends on the sort of appetite, and I think from the foundation's perspective, it remains a priority to ensure that regulators see that the value of the technology that we're bringing, of the principles that we're kind of espousing as well.
Very interesting. In terms of geographic focus, I mean, Marina represents the EU. You talked about the US. We're now in Bangkok, in Asia. Sort of, where do you see maybe your future focus and maybe the industry's future focus?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think in recent times, I mean, just from a regulatory engagement perspective, VARA and Dubai and really the ADGM as well have been new. Have received sort of like new regulatory attention, and indeed many have set up various structures. There. Of course, the U.S. will, I think, particularly now with the change of administration, be a focus, and Asia, I mean, has to be a focus just given demographics, given the shift in inevitable sort of shift in wealth to Asia in the next really 50 to 100 years, already happening. So I think we're protocol again is Near protocol serves users all around the world, and so our focus has to be appropriately sort of apportioned based on where those users and those users of value are, but equally has to remain a global focus.
Karen, from your perspective, you are sort of a European project, at least I would say that as a fellow European, but maybe you don't identify Gnosis like that. How do you self-identify from a Gnosis point of view in terms of geographic belonging, and how have you handled lobbying, talking to regulators in the past, and how do you see it, how you'll handle going forward?
So we are primarily, I would say, a European organization because that's where our roots originate. Although you could argue that Gnosis started from within Consensus, which ultimately was based out of New York. But the founders, at least, very much Europeans. A lot of the initial work that we did focused on setting up business and operating in Europe. And I would say at the very beginning when Gnosis was launched, there was a lot more work being done in lobbying at that stage, just because everything was so new back in 2016, 2017. And they decided to set up their first entity in Gibraltar, and the government there were already consulting for a regulatory framework, and so it was a perfect opportunity for Gnosis at that stage to really work closely with governmental authorities to try and shape what regulation should look like. And that's obviously changed since 2018 when that first regulation came into force, and since we've obviously supported groups like EUCI who have done very good work over the years, and we've seen some success stories. Even I remember when MiCA was being negotiated and drafted, there was language in there at one point where they wanted to capture unhosted wallets and potentially even DeFi, and I think it was a significant effort by the industry to eventually get those struck out, although it seems like through interpretation some of those activities may hopefully, well, we hope not, but we don't know, may end up coming back into scope, but we'll see as from January. And in terms of going forward, I would agree with what Abi said earlier in terms of, it depends where and for what purpose. I think Asia is going to be a massive driver of adoption and growth in the coming years. We've seen regulators in Japan, Singapore, Hong Kong already take active steps to bring in substantial and significant regulation for players who want to operate, so they have significant certainty. But that doesn't mean that our work as an industry ends at that stage, because there's so many other activities within the space that we're involved in which are not subject to regulation, but we know from conversations that we have with regulators that there are issues out there that they're looking at, and whether that's DeFi protocols, whether that's staking, whether that's MEV, whether that's different types of stablecoin arrangements. There's so many different areas which I think will come through another regulatory wave that's not caught now. So I think our job as an industry to continue lobbying different authorities will continue, and we need to play our part in that if we want to create the best framework for all of us to be able to succeed in this space.
Awesome. I would have a last round of questions if I have time, but I don't know. Yes, I do. Okay. Sort of one train of thought is also regarding the potential of self-regulation in this industry, because famously regulators are sort of, you know, the boomers in a sense. They don't really get the tech. They cannot develop a vision that is really sort of ambitious, that fuses the potential of the tech and the, you know, justifiable desires of a regulatory framework, let's say. In your guys' view, maybe which jurisdiction on the planet sort of has gotten it best at the moment? Like, you know, who captured it well, if at all? Like, if you had to say, well, the whole world now has to run under this country's sort of crypto regulation, which one would you pick? In Chiang Mai, everybody was a fan of Switzerland, for example. But, you know, you're from Gibraltar. You guys have seen, I think, everything. So who do you think has the best model at the moment? And how could the industry sort of somehow, you know, potentially leverage self-regulation to show regulators what we're capable of and what actually modern regulation could achieve in terms of social welfare?
Well, you set me up nicely with Switzerland. The NEAR Foundation is a Swiss Stiftung. It was set up there intentionally. And there's a reason why Crypto Valley is in Zug, right? So the Swiss have you know, made an effort to at least establish a modicum of regulatory clarity that did not exist anywhere else. And you know, whether that, you know, advantage will continue in the long run remains to be seen, but I still think it remains a, you know, remains, I think, a sort of model from which others can adapt and learn. So I would put my vote in for Switzerland, but again, it depends from what perspective. So when we talk from the token launch perspective, I would probably just say BVI because there's a reason everybody launches their tokens from BVI. So, or, you know, the series of offshore jurisdictions. So, I mean, it really depends for what purpose, ultimately. But for foundation setups, you know, Swiss or Cayman. And then to come back to the self-regulatory issue, I mean, look, it's been a model that's worked in lots of other industries. I mean, SIFMA, for example, is a structured finance, self-regulatory body. And much like structured finance, this is not an area that has been easy for regulators to kind of grapple with. And so I think, you know, whether it's a SIFMA-style model to begin industry self-regulatory efforts, you know, I think the issue will always be, though, that the umbrella can't be too big because, you know, at some point it becomes too confusing with the various messages from players that are kind of completely differently situated. So I think, yes, it can be a solution, but appropriately kind of bounded, and perhaps, you know, with the sort of virtual asset, well, either virtual asset service provider type entities or you know, similar at first instance.
So for me, I would give a much more general response. I think wherever there's dialogue and clarity, that brings a lot of, I would say, also certainty somehow to how can you plan your business, how can you plan whatever, you know, future, I don't know, markets you want to enter or other products you want to launch. And somehow why Switzerland is also very, in a way, successful is because there's an ongoing dialogue with the FINMA. There's an ongoing, I would say, also certainty when it comes to certain questions there, because it happened for such a long time. They were so early. They were early in giving guidance as well. So that's a very, very good practice. But at the same time, it's like continuously having discussions to also, in a way, learning from each other, from updates, what's going on in the tech. Everyone here this week is saying, you know, blockchains in 2024 are different from the ones in 2017. So much has changed. We talk about ZK, etc. We need to update to that, and basically having some kind of a government that is agile and is understanding this, and it is trying to kind of, be up to speed with the tech. That would be ideal.
You have the last word, man.
Maybe just a comment on self-regulation. I think the biggest issue that I've had with that approach in the past is the lack of teeth that has. You know, you will have many people who will advocate for that and play by the rules, but then you'll also have people who just will do their own thing regardless of, you know, whatever SRO might say or whatever guidelines might exist. And there's very little penalties. There's very little consequences because there isn't legislation through which you can enforce that. You know, that project might lose a bit of credibility, but, you know, in this space, you know, a lot of people are more worried about utility, functionality, efficiency than they are about, you know, the extent to which a particular project is complying with, you know, a self-regulatory position established by a group of, you know, individuals or entities, but that not everyone necessarily buys into. And, you know, people will have different activities which may or may not be within the scope of that self-regulatory framework, and they might feel that there's a better way of doing things, more secure way that is at conflict with that. So I think there is a place for it in order to establish some harmonized standards, but I don't think that's the answer to solving a lot of these regulatory questions and ensuring that people, you know, act with integrity in this industry going forwards.
Very realist here. All right. I think that's it. Thank you very much, everybody. Big applause.